of that time. So, I mean, I do think that, you have to, actually Simon Sharma has also written about this, that you have to occupy, two positions at the same time. That you have your feet in like two different eras. And it's only then that you can achieve any kind of a historical illumination of, what went on.
There's a lady here who's been waiting a long time.
My question is to both of you. I want to ask a question about historical fiction. If we use names of actual characters, say from the 18th century, how far can a novelist use real names of real characters and invent the inner turmoils, relationships, and even perhaps events, keeping the context correct? Keeping this, doing, of course, vast research, as I've been doing about the milieu and the times, the kind of cuisine or anything else, whatever. But how far can one, really invent situations?
You can, I think, because, I mentioned Hilary Mantel. I don't know if you've read her at all.
I have.
Yeah, but I mean, she does exactly what you're describing. And she does imagine situations and conversations and so on to flesh out what history doesn't tell us. But it's based on a bedrock of very solid research. So I wouldn't, provided you make it clear you're writing a novel and this conversation didn't actually happen, it is imagined to some extent, then I see no problem with that.
So names do not have to be changed?
No. Most historical novels have the names of historical figures in.
Yeah, historical fiction, if the genre, if you made clear that what is the genre in which you are writing, I don't think people have any trouble with the fact that you were using real names. Of course, it happens that, sometimes if you're writing on a topic that is politically charged, and then you're using real names and those people are saying things, you may run into trouble.
You can't do it, I think, about living people. I don't think you could write a novel about Sonia Gandhi versus Narendra Modi and suggest they were having a secret love affair and, get away without a few riots. So,
no, but even with dead people, with some dead people, like if you were to write about Shivaji, and if you were to invent certain things about Shivaji, I don't think that will be very good for your health.
But Shivaji actually sparks a thought because, we were brought up, I was brought up at school on stories about Shivaji which were taught to us as part of our Indian history. And I remember reading about this famous stories, how he climbed out of the fort on a rope, and then the story of how he killed the Mughal general Afzal Khan with his Vagnak. But in fact, the other version of that story, which we were not told, was that Shivaji went to a peace meeting with Afzal Khan. Both of them meant to be unarmed, and Shivaji had concealed the Vagnak and treacherously tore Afzal Khan to pieces. So if you, maybe I'm going to be lynched outside by the Shiv Sena, I don't care. So I think a lot of history, not historical fiction, but a lot of history can be quite challenging to people if you write about people who've been put on pedestals.
Right, yeah. But I think in general, I don't think, I guess the test really is that if your reconstruction of the historical milieu seems believable and credible, I don't think anyone, or even a historian, would have kind of problem with it, because they would understand that you are inventing, let's say, dialogue or events and so on. But so long the setting seems kind of authentic, I think that no one would have an issue.
But quite often, as we were saying to each other earlier, we were chatting, truth is stranger than fiction. We've had, for instance, the launch of a major new biography of Gandhi. But if one were to explore Gandhi's sexuality, I think the accounts, especially in his later years, of the kind of sexual antics he got up to prove he was celibate, would, shock most writers of pornographic fiction. And I don't know how much, how it would be received in an Indian market. I think the only people who've written about it have been Western historians.
Yeah, well, Joseph Lelyval's book, I think was banned in Gujarat. And, it ran into some trouble. So, don't pick, a character or topic who's kind of politically charged, and other than, then you're okay.
But if some part of the character is a little circumspect, we can draw the line and shift the line a little further?
Of course you can. You're writing fiction. It's only historical in the sense that you're locating it in a different historical context.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my question is related to what you mentioned about Shivaji. So I learned much later that that history is written by the victors. So history is written by the victors. So while growing up in school, I never realized that we are reading only one version of history, and it's full of biases that a historian might have, or the textbook publishers, or the government. So what is the responsibility of historians, even to present to children, that there is a different version? And I don't think most of the public, or we are aware that there is a different version of the past, that it's not viewed the same as we view it from today's standpoint.
I think historians have a duty to be revisionist where there are grounds to be, where there is new evidence, and where, as you say, history has been written by the victors. And I think revisionist history has a big market, and most publishers are willing to, commission books. So I don't know how a revisionist view of Shivaji would do in India, and there probably wouldn't be a market for it outside India, but what do you think?
Say, for example, even Pakistan.
Support what she's saying, because when we were in school and we studied the Mayflower series, there was a very well-known Mayflower series of history. When we studied that, a lot of things were written about India. We found very much later, when we grew up and started writing ourselves, we began to find that a lot of the things we read were really not what they were in fact. Because when we read Indian history on our own, different books, we found the situation to be quite different from what was actually portrayed in the Mayflower series. And the Mayflower series were textbooks for us in school. So shouldn't historians also have a role to play? I mean, not be creatures of their times and creatures of their, whoever is ruling them or whatever?
Well, I mean, just responding to it, I don't know if you've heard of a school of history called Subaltern Studies. But Subaltern Studies was set up by a group of historians who argued that, as you were saying, much of the history was written by the victors, which meant, for example, if you saw Indian history of the last 200 years, largely in terms of 1947, that everything was moving up to 1947, then what do we do with the history of people or events that don't have anything to do with 1947? For example, there wouldn't have been anything called women's history if all you talked about was achievement of independence in 1947. Because after all, women had a history as women, as mothers, as daughters, as citizens, which were very specific. Or other groups in Indian societies, like Dalits, for example. So Subaltern Studies then began to write history that were written from the sort of subaltern point of view, from the subordinate point of view, which were not histories written just of kind of great men. I mean, we don't need Indian history just of, Gandhi, Nehru, and whoever, Ram Mohan Roy. We create a kind of a narrative from, Bengal Renaissance to 1947, that's the end of history. I mean, there's a lot that history leaves out. And so, with time and change and political movements, you get desires for other kinds of history, and history is written of other peoples, which may not tie up with the kind of official history of India of 1947, but is equally relevant.
But I think it's always important for people to bear in mind as consumers of history that all historians write from their own period and are products to a large extent of their own period. So the idea that any historian is completely objective or cannot be questioned, I think, is wrong to start with. People should be encouraged to question all historical narratives, however, wherever they come from, because we're all products of our own time in some way.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you your opinion about this recent trend, actually not even recent trend, but lately we've been having a lot of films, both in the West as well as here, a lot of films on history. You've spoken a lot about literature. Now in the case of films, because they're a little more in pop culture and they have in many cases have a wider audience. So on one hand you can say that at least because people are going to watch, a lot more people are going to watch a film, they're going to be exposed more to some kind of historical context or characters which they may otherwise not bother to pick up a book or a history book. But on the other hand, a film might probably, because of commercial considerations, they need to have drama, action, and then there's a potential for a lot more distortion there. So what do you feel about this trend of historical films? Like, I mean, do you feel that on the one hand they may expose people who would otherwise not bother to pick up a history book, but on the other hand there's potential for graver distortion there?
I don't think films can substitute for actual history writing. I mean, films can situate themselves, as all films do, they situate themselves in some historical period. And to be, I think, a good film, it has to be credible, it has to be believable. So, for example, unless you are working in a kind of a genre of fantasy, like, for example, the film Inglourious Basterds, where actually the Jews win and the Nazis are defeated. But that's it's taken for granted that it is in that kind of fantasy genre. But if you're not dealing in that fantasy genre, you cannot, for example, show. Let's say if you have a historical film set in the 19th century, you cannot show that in, let's say, Awadh in North India, the Indians are ruling and the British are their slaves. I mean, it historically just wouldn't be credible. So if to be a good film, I think it has, like all the kind of elements that film uses, to be a kind of a believable story, it has to use history responsibly. But I don't think it can really substitute for a history book. I hope not, at least,
But isn't it like a historical novel in that respect, which is that a historical film is a work of fiction. It is not documentary. It doesn't pretend to be,
right.
But it can whet your appetite to know more about a period. And I certainly, as a child, went to historical films, and a lot of my interest and love of history came from that. Although now, when we look at those films, Cecil B. DeMille or whatever, they were, they were not totally putting everything on their heads or turning them upside down, but they were not pretending to be documentaries either.
I mean, you should actually ask Manish Chaudhary here, an actor, who was acting in Bombay Velvet, and he deeply researched that role for months. Now you ask him, so, it's a work of fiction. Why are you researching on where this particular character lived and what did he do, what did he think about, did he have affairs, or, what kind of a watch he wore, what kind of a suit he wore? Manish can,
Well, the character that I was given to play in Bombay Velvet was based on a real person who lived, and so I just thought that it was almost my duty to find out as much as I could about that person's life, how he lived, how he conducted himself in his personal life, in his professional life. Of course, I found out more about his professional life than I could about his personal life. But some of that I've invented in my mind. So I thought it was important for me to to base it as much on reality as I possibly could. And that is what I thought was important for me to do.
And sometimes reality is so fantastic you can't invent it. You know, it's actually, you know, even more interesting than fiction.
Someone just mentioned that history is about victors, and victors history is about whoever is victorious. I also have a feeling that history is also written by those who belong to the victors class. So that probably gives a particular perspective. In that context, when you talked about subaltern history, I feel to an extent that subaltern history is about subalterns, but I want to know, is this something by subalterns? Are they writing their history or somebody is writing about them?
Well, I mean, subalterns in actual history, they acted historically. They did things, which was part of history. It's just that because we are only concerned about whether Ram Mohan Roy started our Renaissance or not, that we never bothered to even find out what the historical actions of these people were and how others responded to it. You know, for example, in Nehru's Discovery of India, there's a very short section which is called Bharat Mata Ki Jai, and where Nehru talks about, you know, walking around India and meeting the peasants who are saying Bharat Mata Ki Jai, Bharat Mata Ki Jai, and sort of Nehru then ponders over this. So what are these people saying? Bharat Mata Ki Jai, does he mean this earth? Does he mean that earth? I mean, how can this earth be mother and so on? You know, he goes through this and then he works out in his mind, oh,